Morning. Welcome to the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission's first hearing of 2025. First, let me give a few thank yous. Thank you to our witnesses for sharing your expertise and for the work you've put into your testimonies. Thank you to the Senate Help Committee for giving us this beautiful hearing room. Thank you to the Senate Recording Studio for their assistance live streaming this event. And most importantly, thanks to our staff for pulling together everything that happens today. As a reminder to everyone attending here in person or listening online, the testimonies of our witnesses are available on the Commission's website, uscc.gov. Having written and listened to opening statements for 2 decades, I can tell you the ones delivered by Commissioner Schriver and I are the least interesting, so I'll keep this very short. Today's hearing is intended to get to the heart of our competition with China. We will examine China's plan to become a manufacturing innovation superpower. 10 years ago, President Xi and China's State Council issued a Made in China 2025 initiative. The initiative lays out China's plans to lead a new technological and industrial revolution. China has stated that it is not content with the United States as the world's economic and technological leader. Their goals was to become a manufacturing innovation superpower by 2025. Breaking news, folks, it's 2025, and I can report that China has made incredible and alarming progress in the technology areas targeted in the Made in 2025 initiative. That leaves us with the question that Commissioner Schriver came up with, which is, who is winning? Today, we will evaluate China's progress in 3 technology areas: biotechnology, aviation, and autonomy. These technology areas demonstrate the breadth of the Made in 2025 initiative. In biotech, China is building the infrastructure to ruthlessly dominate the biotechnologies of the future. In aerospace, China is working to permanently displace the United States and our European allies. In autonomous technologies, from manufacturing to military applications, China has made incredible strides in deploying frontier capabilities. Discussing these technologies today will shed light on questions confronting the Commission over the course of this year. It seems China has delivered in spades for the Made in 2025 initiative. What do the next 10 years look like? What will it take for the United States to respond to China's whole-of-nation innovation strategy? How should we enlist our friends and allies over the next 10 years to make sure the United States is not going it alone? We look forward to hearing from the witnesses on these questions and many more. And with that, Commissioner Schriver, you're an excellent partner on this commission, and I'll turn to you for a brief and undoubtedly amazing statement.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Kuiken. Let me join Commissioner Kuiken in thanking our witnesses. Appreciate putting in all the time that I know you did to prepare these statements. Having reviewed them, they're excellent. Look forward to the discussion. Let me also welcome Commissioner Brands, your first hearing as a commissioner. So thank you for stepping up and serving in this capacity. Made in China 2025 was a bold and audacious project, but it also clearly involved practices and policies that were in violation of China's global trade commitments. The successes of China Made in 2025, which I'm sure we'll hear much about today, do underline the importance for us and those in Congress and in the government to really take seriously what China's stated ambitions are in technology and in supply chain. The experience of the past 10 years demonstrates the immensity of the resources the Chinese leaders are willing to deploy towards these objectives. And there's little reason to suspect China's practices will change. The CCP aims to make China a leader in technological innovation and manufacturing key industries in the future. These are policies not just to achieve domestic growth and self-sufficiency, they are designed to ensure dominance and global dependency on China. Concerns about Made in China 2025 and related policies are most acute when it comes to technologies that augment China's military modernization. As our witnesses will testify, China pursues numerous overlapping policies in support of its goals, ranging from subsidies to various technology transfer policies to outright theft. However, the integration of civilian technology development with military innovation through military-civil fusion means that these industrial policies must be viewed in the context of Xi Jinping's goal to acquire a world-class military. So perhaps most important of all this, we need to understand, does the nature of this technological competition and the potential security implications of key technologies mean that the United States must develop new measures to boost our capabilities and prevent leakage to China? Or can the United States rely on the strength of its innovation ecosystem to simply run faster? So I look forward to the discussion today and learning from the expertise of our witnesses. I have the privilege of introducing our first panel. The first panel will provide a deep dive into how Chinese industrial policy developed 3 technologies that were either explicitly targeted and made in China 2025 or relied on technologies that benefited from this policy. Those 3 areas are biotechnology, aviation, and autonomy. We'll start with Dr. Drew Endy. He's the Science and Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and Martin Family Fellow in Undergraduate Education at Stanford University. Dr. Endy's testimony will evaluate China's progress in biotechnology and its future targets and capabilities in synthetic biology. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Richard Abolafia. He's the Managing Director at Aerodynamic Advisory. He will discuss China's efforts in aviation, especially its challenges developing civilian passenger jets. Finally, we'll hear from Mr. Sunny Chung, Fellow for China Studies at Jamestown Foundation. Mr. Chung will discuss the evolution of autonomous technologies related to Made in 2025 and their military applications. Thank you all again, and the Commission is looking forward to your remarks, and Dr. Endy will begin with you.
Vice Chair Schriver, Co-Chair Kuiken, Commissioners, thank you for inviting me. I want to talk about the cost of time. In 2012, I was leading the United States delegation on synthetic biology as part of a trilateral effort with the national academies to develop a strategy for synthetic biology. Our partners were the United Kingdom and China. Our mission was to create a strategy that could be used to win the future via emerging biotechnologies. We succeeded. We also succeeded in getting London and Beijing to adopt our strategy and begin to implement it. We failed in Washington. That was strange. That was also 13 years ago. Since then, China has taken an all-of-nation approach to advancing biology as a technology. Why is this? President Xi is very clear about China's high-level needs and goals: resilient supply chains, economic self-sufficiency, solving the scourge of infectious disease, food security for a nation that has 4 times as many people as the United States, but only 3/4 as much farmland, social stability in a world and reality that is increasingly volatile. 21st century biotechnologies are arriving on time and are directly responsive to each of these high-level needs. Just as software creates the digital world, biology grows the living physical world. And biotechnology is what allows people to partner with biology to grow ever more of what we need. McKinsey estimates that by mid-century, up to 60% of the physical inputs to our economy will be grown with modern biotechnologies. It's not just the foods and the medicines and the fuels, it's the seatbelts, it's the computers, it's the archival data storage systems, it's the things you could never imagine would be encoded in DNA and grown. What choice did China have 10 and 20 years ago but to go all in on emerging biotechnology? So, what does an all-of-nation approach to advancing biotechnology look like? We hear about military-civil fusion and know how powerful that is, but all-of-nation is bigger than MCF. It looks like this. Real estate families donate billions of dollars to convert 9-story shoe factories in Shenzhen into best-in-the-world genomics facilities. That's how we got BGI. President Xi directly exhorting students and entrepreneurs with very clear statements about the importance of biotechnology. These are hanging in the lobbies of tech centers for decades. When you walk in the building and decide what type of entrepreneur do you want to be, maybe you should be a biotech entrepreneur. Not this year, not 2 years ago, but over a decade ago. Compare that with the 4 administrations it took for us to get an executive order signed in the United States about advancing biotechnology. It also looks like this. Parents with young kids hiring tutors to secure their children's livelihoods. What sort of tutors are we talking about? Genetic engineering. Why? So that when they get to college, they have a better chance at getting on the genetic engineering team. Not the basketball team, the genetic engineering team. That's what an all-of-nation approach looks like. So where are we now? Let's consider biotech ecosystem as a 4-layer cake: education, research, entrepreneurship, manufacturing. We can observe the following. Most teams in the genetic engineering Olympics I started at MIT 22 years ago, they're from China. According to the Australians, most of the research in synthetic biology that's the most impactful is published by Chinese scientists. Used to be the United States. China surpassed us apparently in 2017. That ground that was shaking last month in San Francisco, thankfully it wasn't the San Andreas, but it was what was going down at JP Morgan Healthcare, where for the first time, pharmaceutical innovations were arriving from China. There's also the vibrant biomanufacturing ecosystem that's making money in China. And they're making money with low-value products, with low margins, poised to uptake higher-value products that can't be brought to scale for manufacturing in the United States. Incredible progress by incredible people, working incredibly hard with incredible support. If Lin-Manuel Miranda had been writing a different musical 10 years ago, we would have heard words like, "It must be nice. It must be nice to have President Xi on your side," if you were in biotech. So, I want to talk about the cost of time again. 13 months ago, I was in Washington meeting with another commission, the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology. Their work takes time, and I'm looking forward to their forthcoming report. And they're an A+ team, and I know they're working incredibly hard. But over another year has passed, and here we are, still mostly talking about doing something about emerging biotechnologies. Maybe one day. This is strange. How about this instead? Why don't we simply agree that the Silicon Valley for 21st century biotech will be near Shenzhen? If instead we care to compete, we have less than 1,000 days to make a difference. Even the next year is important. In fact, the next 100 days are important, and tomorrow is important when you meet them. I've offered 8 specific policy recommendations in my written testimony, but I just want to emphasize a common theme that is a puzzle we've got that if we could unwind it would do the most to help the United States compete in biotech. Anyone who's a student of history of emerging technologies knows that we win when we take the very precious public treasure and invest it in the high leverage foundational work. And then we let our entrepreneurs compete on top of that. We win over and over again by doing that. Computing, internet, you name it. Somehow, though, with biotech, we've gotten ourselves turned around. And the reason is pretty straightforward. The applications of biotechnology are so urgent. Cure the disease yesterday. Get more biofuels right away. That the public treasure tends to go in the applications layer, and then we miss on the high leverage foundational stuff. If we could reverse that, we'd be much more efficient, we'd be much more effective, we'd be much more competitive. We instead hemorrhage appropriations on the apps. Please help. Thank you again for your invitation and for your service. I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Endy, thank you very much. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Richard Abalafia, who is joining us virtually.
Well, thank you very much, Commissioner Schriver. To the Commission, thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to testify. My deep regrets and apologies for not being with you in person. Unfortunately, I'm here in Seattle at a conference, but it's my privilege to give you a briefing of what I've provided in my testifying paper and be available for questions. First of all, it's important to consider China's achievements in aviation in the broader context of history. Since really World War I, no company has successfully, I should say World War II, dawn of the jet age just after, no company or country has joined this industry as a player. Embraer of Brazil managed to start delivering regional jets. It's done a very good job of that. But joining the big jet club with Airbus and Boeing, a lot of people have talked about it. A lot of people have tried. No one has succeeded except for China. The old Soviet Union had kind of a parallel industry that developed, starting at around the same time, predictably enough. Of course, like every other consumer product in the old Soviet Union, it died as the wall came down. But China has joined the club. Sometime in the 1970s, they started putting considerable state resources into the development of a jetliner industry. Their first attempt was simply taking a Boeing 707 and copying it, and it became the Shaanxi Y-10. That went very badly wrong, but then they went down a path of actually creating something a bit more locally produced. About 15 years ago, they introduced the ARJ-21 regional jet, the C909, and about 150 of those have been built, but of course other people have joined the regional club. What's new this time is that about a year and a half ago, they began deliveries of the C919, a 150-seat proper jetliner that competes with the heart of Airbus and Boeing's product line. They've delivered, I believe, about 14 aircraft, 12 last year. This is a significant achievement for the simple reason that nobody else in the world has done it. And that alone, I think, is very much worth paying attention to and shows the incredible commitment of resources within China, both in terms of educational and technical institutions, the creation of a dedicated jetliner company sponsored by the state called COMAC, Commercial Aircraft of China. However, I should say that these perhaps aren't the very best jets ever built. The 909, the regional jet, is very much a copy of something that the West built in the 1980s. As soon as they start ramping up their other programs, it's not going to survive. But the 919 is a lot closer to its nearest analog, the Airbus A320neo and the 737 MAX. It's a bit heavier. It's not quite got the same range capabilities, but nevertheless, it's close to the capabilities of its Western equivalents. How did they get there? Well, very simply, lavish resources. Not quite whole-of-nation efforts, but really very significant in terms of just the sheer amount of capital provided to COMAC and to subsidiary organizations. COMAC is in theory a standalone commercial unit, but really its parent is AVIC, Aviation Industries of China, multiple divisions thereof. And that's very much a civil-military crossover organization that is also responsible for meeting China's military needs. So COMAC is kind of a strange entity aimed at commercial markets with a lot of resources, including some of the resources provided to China's military entities. But nevertheless, in theory, at least, it's commercial. There's one big issue with China's jets, however. Most of the equipment, the systems and technologies inside the jet, most particularly the engines, are effectively Western products. Some of those are the result of joint ventures between Western technology companies and systems companies and local Chinese producers, with the stated goal, clearly, of copying them. But there are key areas, particularly engines, where that is not the case, where the engines are simply imported in a box. This represents a major issue for China moving forward. If they're going to achieve true self-sufficiency, they need their own engine industry. Obviously, an aircraft can't get off the ground without engines. They've started working on one, but here the barriers to entry in jet engines are even higher than in the airliner industry. As a matter of fact, there are only 2 countries in the world and 3 companies, Rolls-Royce of Britain and General Electric and Pratt & Whitney of the US, that can build a good commercial jet engine, or indeed a commercial engine of any kind. It's going to take many years and even more resources to be able to meet them with some kind of equivalent. It's not even guaranteed that they'll be able to. Therefore, for just because of engines alone, but certainly other key bottlenecks in technologies, the U.S. can govern what China does moving forward in terms of how many it builds, how many aircraft it builds, in terms of development of next generation aircraft, until they get that jet engine industry up and running. And we don't really know when that is. There are other limits too. For example, establishing a worldwide product support infrastructure is essential for exporting jetliners. That's going to be a very long road. Another question I've addressed in my report is to the extent to which U.S. and Western aircraft companies rely on China. The good news is, from the standpoint of actual value-added technologies, really not at all. The bad news is that there are key materials, whether it's rare earth elements or exotic metals, where, yes, China plays a very significant role, and that's something we need to keep an eye on. In conclusion, I've got a couple of recommendations. The most important to remember is that historically in this industry, a one-nation aircraft program doesn't do very well. Britain and France in the 1950s, for example, or even the Netherlands tried, and the Soviet Union is perhaps the best example. Everything was kept in country. The reason that the West's aviation industry is so great, frankly, is that because it crosses borders. People, capital, ideas, technologies all get shared between the US, Japan, Canada, South Korea, Germany, France, wherever else. And that's an enormous strength. So frankly, I believe the best way to compete with China with its one nation approach is to keep our system open, international, and able to leverage the best technological contribution from all of our friends and allies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Mr. Sunny Chung.
Co-chairs, commissioners, thank you for the opportunity to testify. AI isn't just about large language model, its future lies in the physical world. NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang has recently said that ChatGPT moment for robotics is just around the corner. And Tesla has always predicted that humanoid robotics will surpass the values of cars in the foreseeable futures. And this brings me to Make in China MIC 2025 scheme. Beijing's grand strategy to dominate high-tech industry. Although the name might have faded, the vision remains very much alive. And China is pursuing automation not just to enhance manufacturing, but to reshape economic power, labor, and military capability. The Chinese government at both local and national levels has invested heavily in robotics through industrial plants and MCF military civil fusion fundings. China's goal is clear: to dominate the hardware, software, and supply chains. And through aggressive state-subsidized investment and acquisition, China is not just advancing its domestic industry, but also expanding the influence globally. There are 4 pillars of Chinese robotic and automation expansion. Firstly, industrial domination. China has built the world's largest robotics manufacturing ecosystem. It is now leading in industrial robotic production, rare earth refining, which is critical for actuators and motors, and state-subsidized robotic cluster. Today, it supplies over half of the world's new industrial robots, rapidly replacing foreign suppliers with domestic alternatives. Second, humanoid robotics. While Tesla Optimus prototype is famous, it's still developing. China, however, Unity G1 model has already demonstrated superior mobility at only $15,000, way cheaper than the Western alternatives. Making mass production more viable, China's focus on low-cost, scalable robotics accelerates its advantage in commercial deployment. Thirdly, robotics dog. China is rapidly advancing AI-integrated robotic mobility. Unity B2W robotic dog is now outperforming Boston Dynamics robotic dog in speed, agility, and AI control, signaling China's growing capability in next-generation robotic movement and autonomy. Fourth, China is integrating AI-driven drones and robotic combat system into its military strategy. Its Rainbow, 彩虹, and Wenlong, 翼龙 UAV are widely used by PLA and exported to Middle East and Africa, disrupting Western security interests. These drones have already been deployed in combat zones like Libya, proving their effectiveness in modern warfare. Meanwhile, let's not forget DJI already commands over 90% of the global market in consumer drone, extending Chinese influence in both civilian and defense military UAV system. That being said, despite all the advancement, China still relies on foreign suppliers for some of the critical components to build robots, such as AI chips, high-end actuators, robotic operating system, and this kind of reliance on foreign components represent an opportunity for the US and its allies to contain China's progress by tightening export control on advanced materials and manufacturing tools. China has yet to fully replace Japan and Germany precision motor and harmonic drives, key components for high-precision robotics. This dependency gives the US and its allies leverage to potentially delay and limit Chinese innovation process. And here are my recommendations for the US policymakers. Firstly, I think the US government should establish a dedicated task force or commission to examine critical components essential for robotic development, identifying domestic alternatives for actuators, sensor, AI processor, and implement chips at style policy to secure and strengthen US robotic supply chain. Second, the US government should also restrict Chinese access to key robotic components. And by tightening export regulation on this component, we can potentially slow down the Chinese ability to advance in high-end automation. Thirdly, the US should deepen collaboration with Japan, Germany, and other relevant European countries in order to counterbalance Chinese dominance in robotic manufacturing and innovation. The US should also establish joint R&D program with its allies to ensure that the US has secure access to vital robotic components. Lastly, the US should accelerate the development of AI-driven military automation, focusing on autonomous UAV defense, robotic infantry support, and AI-coordinated battlefield cooperation. To conclude, this is more than a technological race. This is a battle for economic and military power. China is moving aggressively, and China has already met many of the objectives it set a decade ago under the MIC Make in China 2025 Grand Strategy. However, this does not mean the US has lost. In fact, China has not yet achieved full dominance in the supply chain, and we see some vulnerabilities. And then China hasn't realized the full potential of robotics AI yet. That's why the US and its allies must act now to maintain leadership in the robotics and AI, ensuring this technology aligns with the values of the US and interests. And the stake couldn't be higher. Now is the time to act. Thank you, commissioners, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chung. Thank you, all three witnesses. Again, excellent statements. And we're going to begin the round of questioning. And for fellow commissioners, we are going in reverse alphabetical order, starting with the prerogative of the co-chairs. So I will lead off. That means I go first. Dr. Endy, thank you again for your statement. You described the way we apply resources as basically inverted. We're focused more on applications, and I think your strong recommendation that we invest more in foundational biotechnology research. That still strikes me as somewhat of a broad category. Are there particular areas in the broad space of biotechnology foundational research that should have higher priority and move with the sense of urgency? And why might that be?
Thank you so much, Commissioner Schriver. It's a good question. Let me give you two examples. You hear people talking about creating cloud laboratories. Imagine being able to script an experiment on a computer and it runs in a facility somewhere else. We're familiar with cloud computing, AWS, and so on and so forth. people are creating businesses trying to make this real and work on the market. Imagine all of the foundational engineering truths that have to be figured out in order to have a network that actually works. Right? If Cisco long ago wanted to make routers, they needed to get wires to wire up correctly. And to get wires to wire up correctly, we need to have things like units of resistance for electricity flowing through metal, things like the ohm, right? If you're in physics, you understand, like, oh, that's the unit of resistance for electrons throwing through wires. So what are the units for genes turning on and off? For DNA being read out in a cell? For a fermentation process making an energetic compound, right? The answer to all of these questions are crickets. We don't have metrology, the science of measurement, worked out for bioengineering. And so what that means is all of our workflows are Edisonian, tinker and test, do the best job designing with your fancy AI tools. But when you go build the actual thing, you got to put it in a lab and hope and pray that it works, and you try and find the one thing that works, and maybe you have to do that 1,000 times, right? Physically prototyping before you get there. So an example of high leverage foundational research would be in biometrology, the weights and measures of the bioeconomy. Classically in the United States, this has been done by Commerce through NIST. NIST has a physical measurement lab, a materials measurement lab. It's how we get the kilogram, the second, that gives us GPS and everything else. But we don't have a biomeasurement lab. So that's an example of something, if you hadn't thought about it before, it's underneath the surface of things. It's like, whoever thinks about that? Well, that's because the ohm was figured out in the 19th century, right? And we depend on it now. So metrology would be an example. Here's another thing. If you want to win in anything in emerging tech, you got to be smart, you got to be hardworking. But what's more important is the tools you've got for observing, making measurements, making models, computing, prototyping, right? So tools for making, modeling, and measuring with and of biology, absolutely critical. Why do we only have breakthroughs like CRISPR once every decade or so? Like, that's bizarre. There's so much low-hanging fruit. The answer is because we are not laser-focused on how people spend time and money when they do biotech research. When our students do something, when our entrepreneurs do something, where does the time and money go? And if we pay attention to that, we could ask, where are there opportunities for improving the tooling? Ever better tools for ever better biotechnology. The secret sauce of Silicon Valley is not all the things we consume, but it's the fact that it's got a critical mass tool developer ecosystem that makes ever better tools for measuring, modeling, and making electrical systems. We need that critical mass engine running for biotechnology. A specific recommendation then would be to create a national biotechnology accelerator that's not doing biofuels for the Department of Energy or biodefense for the DoD, but its only mission is to make better tools. These are all relatively tight, not too expensive packages that have unbelievable leverage and ROI.
Thank you. I'm going to try to get a second question in here to Mr. Chung. You described, my words, not yours, but basically a combination of the run faster side and the thwart and export control side. And you mentioned the key role of allies, and I would suggest that reviewing our efforts on semiconductors have been pretty successful in getting allies to come along, although that group of countries that are involved in the true choke points, is relatively small. Are you aware of any discussions with allies and how willing they might be to cooperate on export controls in the area of robotics and other areas you addressed?
Thank you, Commissioner Schriver, for the question. I think it's a very point is I don't think U.S. has ever initiated a very large-scale delegation or try to have a bilateral negotiation with the counterparts like Japan and Germany regarding the robotic development, especially just 3 years ago in 2022. Chinese, one of the biggest, largest industrial robot manufacturer, Meide Group, and then this group is based in the Greater Bay Area in Foshan. And 3 years ago, this company, already the largest industrial robotic groups in the world, purchased another Germany historic and leading group in terms of industrial robotics. and it's called Kuiken AG. This company was founded in 1898, one of the most historical and role-leading automation and humanoid robotic company. But then the German government didn't ban it, and they just allowed that. They allowed the Chinese larger robotic company to purchase one of the historical state symbolic company in Germany, and in order to enhance the productivity and try to absorb the German engineering expertise for the Chinese. So I feel like, especially for countries like Germany, we haven't seen any pattern that they are really just trying to take this seriously and try to align with US export control or the grand economic statecraft strategy in order to contain the Chinese modernization progress in robotics and AI. However, I think Japan is a very different story. Japan has been traditionally a strong ally for the United States. I think there is a lot of leeway and leverage if the US start negotiating with the Japanese counterparts in terms of robotics exclusively. I think the room is still likely, and I think there's a lot of room for them to collaborate. Because as a matter of fact, actually the Chinese, when they conducted a net assessment, we have seen the Chinese have been making argument about, like, they know that at the end of the day, Japanese, when they control perhaps 90% of motors or very advanced robotic components, they know that if one day the Japanese try to ban order this kind of like export of this component and try to follow and conform with the US leadership, and then they will be doomed. So that's why China, since years ago, has already started the domestic discussion about how to localize the supply chain, how to replace their reliance on Japanese components. They haven't done that yet. They still rely on Japanese components somehow. So before it's too late, I really highly recommend the US government to talk to the Japanese counterparts on this matter.
Thank you. Sounds like a lot of work to do with both partners, but I appreciate you highlighting that. Commissioner Kuiken.
Thank you. First of all, excellent opening statements. Really appreciated all of them. Mr. Chung, Randy kind of took my question here. So talk to me about where the United States should think about making investments in terms of delivering military capability in the space that you sort of talk about.
Thank you so much. I would go back to my example regarding military drones. We all know that, US and Israel have been two of the largest military drone suppliers to the world. However, China is really catching up in recent years, and I don't think many people really discuss the two most advanced military drone, as mentioned, the Winglong and Rainbow series of Chinese military drone. Just last year, Chinese has sold more than 50 Winglong series military drone to Pakistan.
So, Mr. Chung, is it drones that we need to invest in, or the software that enables them?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? When we talk about drone, it's always about the hardware and software behind that. So, when we try to invest in military drones, it also includes, the technology behind that and the software behind that. One quick example is that China is still lacking behind the turboprop engine, but now in their most advanced military drone, they are just armed with the turboprop engine, which they actually recently perhaps purchased from the Germany counterpart. So I would recommend that in order to develop this kind of technology to compete with China, we need more stipend, we need more economic incentive for the industry, because one of the strengths for the Chinese military drone is about the cost. So we need to ensure that the US can provide affordable and also well-performance military drones to your allies in order to ensure that the global military drone market is not only occupied by the Chinese counterpart.
That's helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chung. Dr. Andy, you talked about seatbelts, computers, semiconductors in your examples. If I'm the Chinese government, I'm probably trying to think about military applications as well. Obviously, semiconductors go on platforms and things like that, but what are the other sort of military applications, just to sort of unlock our thinking about biotech and the opportunities in that space that undoubtedly Chinese researchers are thinking about?
Thank you, Commissioner Kuiken. You need to supply an army. What does an army need? All right, so food, fuel, materials. I mentioned in passing the possibility of biosynthesis of energetics. right? So the supply chains for making the things that cause things to move around and go boom. That's not an example of a future biotechnology. That's a biotechnology that's emerged over the last decade. But anything to do with operating a military, and anything you can make genetically encoded can be manufactured through biology. One of the interesting twists around this is that we're familiar with industrial supply chains, centralized manufacturing, big factories. Biology in nature is the opposite of that. The leaves on trees don't come from factories. They grow in place with the energy and materials that arrive where the tree is. And so biology promises forward, if you will, manufacturing or distributed manufacturing. There's other things that show up when you begin to do convergence of technologies. So you think about biology being fed with sunlight or sugar, but you can actually now imagine building with biology starting with electricity. And so anywhere you could source electricity and then pull carbon out of the air, you run a type of electrobiosynthesis process. Again, general purpose, so anything you need that can be genetically encoded, you could make. This is all in support of operations, if you will. In my written testimony, I have a mention of other possibilities, specifically related to biological weapons. My own view is we've all been blessed over the last 50 years to live in a world where there is no nation that brags publicly about having a biological weapons program, and we should do everything possible in partnership with Beijing and others to make sure that stays the same. Absolutely. But there is that other side. I don't want to go into that gratuitously, just mention it in response to your question.
I didn't run out of time. So Dr. Abolafia, should the U.S. and Europe consider constraints on what is available from a parts perspective on China? So you talked about the supply chain, how it's sort of relying on the U.S. and the Europeans predominantly right now. You got into this sort of jet engine piece. I think we saw this graphic in preparation for this hearing that sort of showed where everything comes from. It's probably your graphic. Would be interested in sort of your views on whether or not the U.S. and Europeans should consider that.
Yes, thanks so much for that question, Commissioner. It's absolutely essential to consider what we give them because obviously there's no intellectual property protection whatsoever. Having said that, I think it's extremely important to keep China within the Western ecosystem supply chain because the alternative of having them completely decoupled would lead to a situation where we would have no leverage whatsoever about the evolution of their aviation business, and where other parties could simply go their own way. Like, for example, there's nothing that Europe couldn't provide, everything really. So I think it's important to have the U.S. with its presence somewhere in the supply chain for Chinese platforms. I'm also concerned about the idea of China completely just breaking away and achieving complete autarky, which would be tremendously expensive in the aviation business and almost certainly guarantee second-rate products. But I think it would also lead to, well, frankly, just a lot less leverage over their evolution in terms of transportation policy, in terms of national defense and everything like that. But yes, I think it would be good to keep a close watch. And we already, to a certain extent, have this. Like, for example, the U.S. has prohibited the export of certain products and technologies when identified as being a concern from a dual-use perspective. I believe there was a helicopter engine, I seem to recall it was the China Z9 helicopter, that required a Pratt & Whitney PT6 turboshaft. This is about 10 years ago, and we prohibited the export of that. We also have the ability to basically just declare COMAC to be a military end user because of the nature of its ownership via AVIC, and we have exercised that in the past. For example, their national turboprop transport, the MA700, is effectively now dead in the water because we've denied them the license for a PW150 turboprop engine. This happened about 3 years ago, I believe. So I think we're doing a pretty good job. We should be doing perhaps just a little bit more, and of course, remaining vigilant in terms of, well, monitoring the system for cyber espionage, because that's been a feature of the landscape, unfortunately. And it's, as I'm sure the Commission well knows, it's very difficult to keep the system completely secure, and it's important to maintain constant vigilance. But in terms of the areas, I'd mostly focus on avionics and all of the computational whatever system that goes into displays, everything from weather radars and whatever else.
Thank you very much. We're going to continue with the questioning, and the co-chairs did not set a very good example when it comes to time management, so I'm going to encourage my fellow commissioners to do as we say, not as we did. Commissioner Stivers.
Thank you, Commissioner Schriver. I guess that's the co-chairs of the hearing have that ability to do that. But I'll try not to go over my time. Dr. Endy, thank you for focusing on the cost of time. Unfortunately, we've been having these similar discussions on this strategic competition on emerging tech for years. We've seen a lot of progress in the private sector, not as much progress on U.S. policy, which I think from your testimonies has probably been modest at best. Are all of your conclusions today that, correct me if I'm wrong, that we are losing ground, and if there isn't a course correction on U.S. policy in the next months and short-term years, that will be overtaken by China on these particular technologies?
Commissioner Stiver, yes.
Mr. Chung? Is that your conclusion?
Yes, that's my conclusion, and then, yeah, I welcome to other questions. Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Abulafila?
Sorry, yes, I concur.
Okay, thanks. Thanks. I just wanted to get that as a very clear takeaway from this hearing. Dr. Endy, in your written testimony, you talked about the Biosecure Act. Can you comment on that, your views on that bill, and if there are things that can be done to improve that legislation in the new Congress?
It's a defensive crouch. You don't win a race by crouching. And so our every instinct, as we've experienced China's ascendancy in emerging biotechnologies and real biotechnology, has been to try and hit the stop button. And everybody understands why we want to do that, and sometimes you have to do that. But if you only hit the brake pedal and you're trying to win a race, you're going to lose. We need to learn how to push the go pedal as hard and as smartly as possible. And so I don't really want to get lost in the Biosecure Act, because although it's well-intended, it's not law. And it's not law because our pharmaceutical industry domestically has an overwhelming dependence on the contract research organizations that offer these services. And it's not obvious that you could instantly disentangle it without causing our domestic innovation framework in pharma to go to zero or near zero. So it's a tough situation. And as I mentioned in the written testimony, imagine if it was the same for information technology. Imagine if our IT layers were only supported by cloud computing services and capacities that were operated in China. Like, we'd never get into that situation. But somehow we've gotten that situation in biotech, and it's like normal. So, like, a lot to talk about, but just recognize that the Biosecure Act, well-intended and important, isn't going to get us to victory, right?
Thanks for that. Mr. Chung, you've written a lot about China's Greater Bay Area Initiative, which is basically Beijing's effort to economically and socially integrate Hong Kong with mainland China. Can you talk about the Greater Bay Area Initiative and its role in the technologies you've talked about in your testimony, but also I know you have a greater knowledge of these issues, and why we should be concerned about its role in Made in China 2025?
Thank you so much for your question. A little bit context regarding the Greater Bay Area GBA scheme. So the Greater Bay Area for the past 4 decades has been the largest regional economy for China and contributing almost 1/3 of the Chinese GDP there. And the GBA region alone, actually the GDP has surpassed South Korea in terms of GDP scale. And in terms of industrial robotics, more than 44% of the industrial robotics generated and created in Greater Bay Area. And that's why GBA has been one of the national initiatives promoted by Xi Jinping. And then GBA has a lot of advantage. First of all, they have Shenzhen, the DJI headquarters there, and they have Hong Kong and Macau. Hong Kong is an international financial hub. And not many people know that actually Hong Kong is the second largest IPO center for biosecurity. So a lot of bio companies, pharmaceutical companies go to Hong Kong to seek funding. So with this context, we recognize that, actually GBA has really an important role for the MIC 2025. And then we also see that how Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and other Guangdong province policy have been promoting MIC 2025 schemes and goals in terms of funding, in terms of state regulations, and try to promote more incentive to allow medium-sized companies or unicorn companies or large tech giants in Shenzhen in order to compete with their Western counterparts.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Sims, welcome in from the great state of Alabama.
Thank you. Roll Tide.
Please proceed.
So we talk a lot in this commission, these hearings, about competition between the U.S. and China. It's an economic competition, it's a technology competition, it's a military competition, but at its most foundational level, it's a competition of systems. And so I'd be curious to hear from each of you in the areas where you focus. How do you see the strengths and weaknesses of the two systems playing out? And I'll say no one's going to accuse you if you say the Chinese have an advantage in this way or the other by virtue of their authoritarian system, that you're advocating for that system. But how do you see that playing out in your areas of expertise? And maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Indy.
Yeah, the ship of state. If you're lost at sea, who makes the decision where to go? The captain, the navigator, or a vote of the crew? It depends. So, ways of working that allow for crisp decision-making can get things to happen sooner and faster and risk bigger mistakes. Democracies are harder to get organized and underway. When that maps to biotechnology, what do you see? It's why, for example, I like to highlight food security as it relates to China. Last time I was in Beijing, I was having dinner with the agricultural minister. His concern and surprise was that China had enough food and water. That is an advantage for China as they seek to advance biotechnology. There's an urgency there that we don't feel in the same way in the United States. Yes, we care about food quite a lot, but not as intensely. Then it's going to come down to other factors. How quickly is the world changing? If things start to change more quickly, we're going to need to deploy biotechnologies more quickly. Climate-resilient crops. What happens if you simply cannot grow things where we used to grow them because the temperature is different or the salinity in the soil is different? How do you adopt crops to survive fast enough? It's not that we can't do it, and historically we've done it over and over again in the United States, but for the United States to work well, what I've observed is we need to have a positive aspirational message. We did this when we went to the moon. The thing about biotechnology that's different than Apollo, though, the Earth only has one moon, one place to go. Biotechnology's got 1 million places to go. How would Apollo have been different if we had 1 million moons orbiting the planet? We would have done things like SpaceX a lot sooner because there's so many places to go. And so, there are some advantages in China because they can move faster, and that's coupled to their high-level needs. We can do the same, but to unlock our superpower, we need to have that shared aspirational vision for why it matters.
Thanks. Mr. Chang?
Thank you for your question. I think this is a very important question. I concur with you that the modern era technological competition is a competition of ecosystem, and China is doing so remarkably well. For example, in terms of robotic development, we all heard of, as mentioned, we have heard of the Unitree, and then right I think just a month ago, when Huawei see that Unitree is really excelling in robotics, and now they really recruited Unitree to become the only supplier of future Huawei robotic development. And at the same time, Huawei has innovated their own home domestic operating system called Harmony OS. This is just like similar to iOS system. And this Harmony OS system is being exported to all major robotic companies in China right now, more than 10 top 10 companies right now, because they believe that in terms of to ensure the operating system of robotic AI to be smooth and not relying on Western technology, Huawei has to support that. And Huawei has been doing that. And also at the same time, when we talk about another tech giant, robotic tech giant in China, it's called Sun. And this company has been working closely with BYD, the largest EV company in China, to work together to provide industrial robotics, robotic arms to ensure that BYD can produce EV at a very efficient way in order to ensure that BYD can also become the giant in their own industry and to compete with the rest. So we see that despite all the state sponsor and subsidized initiative we have been talking about, actually the ecosystem itself, companies behind them also support each other and form a very strong ecosystem.
Mr. Abalafia, maybe just 15 seconds if you got a short thought on it.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Commissioner Sims. I think there's some big differences. Of course, there's no diversion of resources. This is a single-minded focus. There's no, let's focus on returning cash to shareholders. It's just, let's develop a national aircraft industry. That's an impressive advantage. However, the advantages of an open system where you can cooperate with other countries and you can innovate while providing intellectual property protection to your partners around the world and make sure you get best in breed systems and technologies in new platforms is, I would think, an overwhelming advantage for the West.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Madam Chair, Commissioner Price.
Thank you. And thank you all for participating today. This has been very, very enlightening in several areas. Dr. Endy, I want to go back to the cost of time. I'm very taken with this. You specifically said we have less than 1,000 days. That's a startling way to get the point across. Can you expand on why you picked that number?
One of the objectives in the 2012 strategy for synthetic biology was the construction of a cell from scratch. When I'm in Washington, I get asked what type of cell we're talking about. Is it a bacteria or a yeast or something? And my favorite answer is it's an American cell. And what I mean by that is Unix was an American operating system made in New Jersey. Whichever nation is the first to realize some of these foundational advances that are at the core of bioengineering will have an advantage in perpetuity. These are coordination solutions that just change the game. Remember that 2012 strategy, well, this goal of building a cell from scratch, it's on the 2032 deadline, 20 years out from 2012, we're ahead of schedule. So something like that's gonna be true within the next 1,000 days. Is it gonna happen here or somewhere else? Should it be in cooperation? Should it be multilateral or otherwise? There's a number, in other words, there's a number of these achievements which are effective coordination solutions that are winner-take-all accomplishments. And if we don't get them, we just lose that in perpetuity. Where do you go for search? You're going to go to Google. Where do you go to law school? If you can, you're going to go to Yale. All right? Where do you go? Where do you go? Once those answers get into place, it's hard to change them. And so that's what is right in front of us with biotech. And if we miss it, we miss it. The window's now.
Thank you. You also, in your written testimony, talk about 90% of raw ingredients for antibiotics come from China. Can you talk a minute about that more? And is that something we watched happen? And what forces made us get to that place?
We talk about a lot the supply chain dependencies for computer chips. The same is true for essential medicines. And many other things that are made by biology. China is very good at biomanufacturing. We are good at biomanufacturing in the United States for a few things, such as biofuels, but we don't have a surplus of fermentation capacity in this country. And so when innovators want to figure out how to bring their product to scale, I'm not talking pilot scale, I'm talking full-scale manufacturing, what we're finding is they simply can't find the factories or facilities here domestically. In contrast, when you have an all-of-nation approach to biotechnology, you're seeing significant capital investments in 21st century biomanufacturing farms, effectively, with holistic site engineering, access to cheap power, access to wastewater treatment, all the things you have to do to make this work. And so it simply becomes easier in an open market to get better access to efficient capital by doing manufacturing overseas. It's the same playbook you've seen in batteries, solar panels, you name it. And it just happens to land on things we care about that are made by biology, like antibiotics.
Thank you. To Mr. Abulafia, I hope I got that right, and Mr. Chung, we spend a lot of time talking about economic stresses that are happening in China right now. Can you talk about if there's been any impact on the sectors you've addressed, in particular, Mr. Abulafia? Maybe we'll start with you.
Thanks, Commissioner Price. So far, no. You know, it's quite. We monitor air travel demand very closely, and it has made a pretty strong comeback after a few stumbles, you know, relative to where things were before the pandemic. And of course, it's that desire to have self-sufficiency to transport people within and without the country that's driving these jetliner developments. So as long as air travel demand growth remains robust, they're going to pursue development of these aircraft. Similarly, you've seen a strong comeback in the number of imported jets. At one point, 2018, I believe they took about 350 Western jets, representing roughly 23% of global jetliner output from Airbus and Boeing. Then it effectively collapsed as a consequence of the pandemic, along with geopolitical tensions between China and the West. It's making a good comeback. It's about 160, 170 jets last year. So that, I think, also speaks to their desire for a homegrown solution that replaces those aircraft. And we've seen no evidence of a diversion of resources away from their aerospace development priorities as a consequence.
Okay, go ahead and answer.
Sure. Thank you for your question. A very short reply is that despite all the economic hardship and then the aging population, all this kind of problem, the Chinese industrial robotic production actually has been increasing. I think one of the major reasons is that Chinese government has been putting a lot of investment, as mentioned, from state and national level. And at the same time, they also ensure that their very own production, their innovation, the robotic arms, for example, can actually help them to further increase the production. So when we talk about productivity in terms of robotic industry, China is doing really well in this domain.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Commissioner Miller.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Schriver. Mr. Abulafia, unlike many of these sectors that we're assessing today, the aviation sector seems to be something of a success story. Industry relies on relatively few direct inputs from Chinese suppliers. U.S. companies haven't transferred their tech in return for market access in the PRC. The sanctions regime, in this case, the military end user list, has been applied and appears to have some teeth. From this, can you apply any broader lesson to U.S. efforts to sensibly manage competition in other sectors like semiconductors?
Well, thanks very much for your question, Commissioner Miller. You know, I don't want to move too far out of my swim lane, but it seems that there are some interesting lessons that could be drawn. For one, you know, I tend to think that because of the success we've seen in managing the West's response to China's aspirations in the jetliner business, it's perhaps important to be mindful that decoupling is perhaps not the best idea. A total and complete break is perhaps not the most productive solution because they have tremendous resources, and you know, obviously anything that keeps them within the fold, anything that keeps them at the point where we could conceivably cut off key technologies is to our advantage. frankly. I think it's also just very important to be mindful of, three possible ways of working with them. One is an absolute no. We will not, give you this access to this technology. Another is we will give you access to this technology and make it available in such a way that the technology will be shared. And obviously, you need to keep a very close eye on what technology and how accessible it is to them, because of course they're going to copy it and create a homegrown solution. We've seen this with countless components and systems and technologies in the aviation business. And the third is, we like supplying you, we like having a level of control on your supply chain, but we're not going to participate in any kind of joint venture or future technology development. So we keep it protected, even encrypted, and it gets delivered in a large box, and you can use that system, but you have no access to the architecture of that system. So those are the three buckets I would view exports and cooperation on a technological level with China with.
Thank you. I'd like to ask each panelist for a brief response to the following question for the record. How would you best characterize U.S. export controls on key technologies in the area or areas of your expertise? Absolutely critical, useful, not important, or counterproductive? We can start with Dr. Endy. And keep in mind, this is not to say only export controls as a component of a strategy.
Well intended, good luck.
I think it's useful in terms of robotic supply chains.
I regard it as absolutely critical given the dual-use nature of many aerospace technologies and components.
Mr. Chung, back to you. Take us to the battlefield for a moment. We've seen a lot of pictures of robot dogs shooting lasers out of their tails. You can imagine Terminator machines, but most of the conversations we have suggest that the robotics we need to be worried about on the battlefield are not that. It's certainly drones, underwater drones, in-air drones, other things. What should the military in particular be most focused on in terms of the robotics area, in terms of battlefield concerns in the future?
China is already leading in military drones in terms of production and also the creativity they have been using. Like they have just recently, 2 months ago, innovated another drone mothership in Zhuhai Air Exhibition Festival. And then in this, air drone mothership, they have been really showcasing a lot of capabilities that the US currently doesn't have. But at the same time, I want to go back to your robotic dog question. I don't think this is a very futuristic question, because also in the same exhibition, in the weaponry exhibition in Zhuhai, for the first time, they showcased that more than one robotic dog. Actually, the PLA media called that robotic Wolverine, because only Wolf can actually move that, with a scale and at the same time to mobilize them together. And each robotic dog actually is equipped with a ground-to-ground missile and also other types of weapons. So for example, in this scenario, I would say the US government should also be aware of the situation and try to do more in order to counter this kind of developments, both in air and on the ground and also on the sea.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Goodwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me join my colleagues in extending my appreciation to the panel for all their hard work and their testimony today. Dr. Endy, in response to Commissioner Price's question, you indicated that the first to adopt some of these foundational technologies will have an advantage in perpetuity. And I want to explore that a little bit with regard to this notion of the diffusion deficit, which you've, I'm sure, heard some scholars talk about to refer to the gap between the country's ability to adopt new-to-the-world innovations and their corresponding ability to diffuse, distribute, and have those innovations and inventions adopted at scale. Viewed through that prism and that notion, some of the traditional metrics for measuring innovation and innovation capacity, like patents, R&D spending, and publications, don't provide the whole picture. And instead, the talent pool, workforce investment, and the market itself may be better indicators. Wanted to get a sense from you as to this notion of the diffusion deficit with regard to the biotech sector, and both in China and the United States, and what impact, if at all, you think it would have on the advancement and deployment of biotech innovations.
Mr. Goodwin, thank you for your question. It's a good question. Just reflect a little bit as an educator. Our number one job when we're in the classroom is to inspire the student to do the hard work of learning. And if you can do that, then you have the same diffusion issue in the classroom, if you will. It's why I was trying to focus some of my remarks on how inspired the Chinese people have become about biotechnology, and not just the students, all through the stack. Right? If you look at the reports coming out of the JP Morgan conference, when people are now visiting China looking to do acquisition of pharmaceutical innovations, what they're encountering is people who are completely enthused and energized to make this real. So I don't see any diffusion limitation on uptake in biotech innovation in China. The puzzle we've got in the United States, frankly, is we still don't really think about biology as a technology. We think about electronics as a technology. The reason we didn't hit the go button in 2012 when we had the strategy in hand that others adopted was because of concerns around GMO foods. And so I actually think we've got a greater diffusion challenge around biotech domestically because we haven't quite figured out how to explain it as a technology that people could fall in love with.
So from your perspective, you don't see any challenges with regard to the education system in China or workforce development there that would inhibit their ability to deploy biotech advancements?
Thank you again, Commissioner. No, I do not, and I would additionally note that they have other advantages still. So for example, if you want to make stuff at scale, you got to manufacture. You need process engineering. You need chemical engineers who know how to do this stuff. We grew up in this nation learning how to do all of that stuff, starting with petroleum. That entire skill set needs to be applied for biomanufacturing. But our training and workforce around biomanufacturing and the places where we would do that sort of education and training has eroded. So I would say, again, we're disadvantaged domestically.
Thank you. Mr. Chung, in your recommendation to create a new committee on robotics, one of the things you would have them focus on would be to map supply chains to identify vulnerabilities and dependencies. A couple of years ago, we actually made a recommendation to create an office, centralized office, that would help map supply chains across the board, across sectors and across government agencies. And the benefits of such centralization are fairly obvious: avoiding silos, hopefully enhancing coordination and the like. The challenge, I think, as we acknowledged at the time, is so much of the critical know-how and expertise is supply chain specific, industry and sector specific, and even product specific. So how do you square that circle? Do you think robotics is a sector where specialized, dedicated, exclusive supply chain mapping would be more beneficial?
Thank you, Commissioner, for your question. I would say that, first of all, we have to, on the same page on something. For example, where is the end game of AI? If we believe that the ultimate form of AI is in the physical world, then we see the necessity to establish this kind of task force and commission to study the supply chain. And then regarding the supply chain, I would say, within the robots, there are just so many critical components in terms of the motion control module, and an operating system, and even the robotic drone. So I think the US is leading in some way, but the Chinese also is leading in another way. So that's why I think this kind of very exclusive task force is very critical to understand that how the map is, what is the ecosystem now, and then which area is US leading, and which area actually perhaps is Japan or Germany leading, and whether or not the US government should actually actively collaborate with your counterpart in order to ensure that US has the most secure access to this robotic component. So I would say that all kind of, especially at this very early development stage, many components are still very crucial and essential. So that's why we have to study that, at advance.
Thank you.
Thank you. Joining us virtually from the great state of New Jersey, Commissioner Friedberg.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of our witnesses. Mr. Abulafia, if I could start with you. Aviation seems to be, it's an interesting area because it's one in which China has evidently had a priority for some time of developing a commercial airliner, and they've been trying, but they seem not to have been able to do it. Could you explain why that's so? And in particular, I wanted to ask you about two possibilities. Is it the case that this is just a very complicated and difficult problem, and everybody has difficulty doing it? Is it because there are only two companies in the world that are capable of doing it, and they have an incentive to control the diffusion of the relevant technologies themselves? Is it both? Is it something else? Why is it so hard?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Commissioner Friedberg. It's really the heart of the matter, isn't it? I think there's a couple of things. For one, just intrinsically, the barriers to entry in this business are just exceedingly high. Another is that you got to consider the economics, the nature of the user community. There are a lot of like military products. You can be within 5% in terms of performance, and maybe it really doesn't matter. You might take a few more casualties, but still your military power is your military power. And consumer goods comes down to sticker price, features, cars, whatever else. Aviation is different because the user community has extremely thin profit margins and a great deal of competition, which means if you have a product that's 5% inferior, it means your competitor can outprice and outprofit you. You really shouldn't be in the business. And so there's that. The other is the fundamental nature of China's approach to this business. You've got one of the biggest markets in the world, biggest single export market in the world. You've got tremendous talent, you've got tremendous resources. I would argue that the only thing they could do to mess up this rather promising proposition is what they're doing, which is to create state-owned enterprises that mandate technology transfer and provide no intellectual property protection. That guarantees that people are going to show up, without any input from Airbus and Boeing. They're just naturally going to pull back and protect their IP. So you've got a lot of folks showing up for these joint ventures with systems saying, well, here's our latest and best as of 1996. And I think that explains why, the 909 is one of the worst jets ever built, and why the 919 is just a notch behind the A320neo and 737 MAX in terms of performance capabilities. If they were to change that approach and become, say, like a proper integrator of input systems like an Airbus, a Boeing, or Embraer, they'd probably be very good. The great irony here is the only thing that they could do to mess up a very promising picture is kind of what they're doing.
All of your comments, if I understand it correctly, have been about the commercial aviation business and China's difficulties in developing engines, in particular for commercial jets. What about the military sector? And can you comment on the quality of China's military jet engines?
Yes, thank you. This is an area they made tremendous improvement. For many years they were wedded to Russian engines, and the Russians, of course, as an outgrowth of the old Soviet Union military-industrial complex, produced a decent engine. Again, you can be within 5 or 10% in terms of reliability, in terms of fuel burn, and it only shows up in slightly higher casualty numbers. Tragic, but not the same as, why bother, as in the airline business. However, the Russians were getting a bit wise to this and prohibiting exports of engines and saying, well, no, you have to buy our fighter jets. We're really annoyed at you for creating your own fighter jet industry, which they've done. So they've gone down the path of creating their own jet engine industry for military products with the WS-10, WS-20, and other engines, and they've done pretty well. I would argue they're getting very close, if not at the level of the Soviet Union, or I should say Russia's military engine capabilities. That doesn't necessarily at all translate to success given the white-hot competition associated with commercial jet engines. Far from it. There are many countries like France, for example, that do a good military engine, but can't seem to do a commercial jet engine, except as part of a joint venture or something.
Okay.
So they made progress.
All right. Thank you. I think I'm out of time, but if we have a second round, I have some other questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we will. Commissioner Friedberg. Welcome again, Commissioner Brands.
Thank you. So, Dr. Indy, I wonder if we could come back to well-intentioned but good luck. And so it strikes me that the conventional wisdom around a lot of these critical technology sectors is that you need a two-part framework for success, promoting your own innovation and perhaps restricting the other side's. Are you skeptical about the restrict part of that framework as a general matter in the biotech area, or is it a question of doing something other than export controls and the things that have been proposed so far?
Thank you, Commissioner Brands. I would just point out some of the unique characteristics of living systems. They're capable of growing and reproducing. The tools of synthetic biology allow for interconvertibility between the realm of the physical and the realm of the digital. So you can take physical biology, sequence the DNA, you can have a digital representation of the code, and you can download and grow if you can remake the DNA. And so we've got a situation where we've got reproducing machines that can be digitally encoded and transmitted around the internet. And so, you know, maybe some of the lessons that would be good to look into and draw upon outside of my lane would be in software and how we governed, control of software while promoting its development. But those are some of the structural challenges that underlie, you know, how you might want to think about, you know, being mindful stewards of diffusion and proliferation in biotech specifically.
So a second question for you. You said in your written statement and a little bit in response to an earlier question that the U.S. and China should find common ground and creative approaches to strengthen their opposition to biological weapons. Could you say a little bit more about what that looks like and what its feasibility would be in the context of a pretty fierce technological competition?
Yeah, let me give you an example. I serve on the commission that advises on variola virus research. Variola is smallpox. Smallpox killed more people in the last century than all wars combined, hundreds of millions of people. Research with smallpox is governed by a multilateral committee. We oversee the work in Novosibirsk at Vector and at CDC in Atlanta. What will happen to that committee is a little bit up in the air right now, but never mind that. And so, you know, even in a context where you have Chinese, Russian, and American and other scientists tackling a very tricky and dangerous topic, we can figure out how to work that together. I'll give you another thing, just as a quick example. How many times have any of us wondered or been asked ourselves, where did SARS-CoV-2 come from? It's a good question. Here's a better question. Why have we made it so hard to answer that question? And what could we do to make it easier to answer questions like that? The answer becomes, again, a type of cooperation, multilateral frameworks that don't establish trust, but get rid of some types of distrust. So it just becomes easier. Thank you.
Mr. Chung, one of your recommendations was to consider creating a dedicated open source intelligence agency, which strikes me as a good idea in general, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about why it would be so particularly useful in this specific context.
Absolutely. Thank you for your question, Commissioner. I would say that, the very first reason is that because I'm now working on, at a think tank based on open source intelligence, and I do see the merits of that because I think, generally speaking, Westerners are so, they are not aware that how many information are still publicly available or even commercially available online on different kind of like Chinese platform. So when you have this kind of like OSINT agency to dedicate them to look into the Chinese website platform, and then you can find a lot of useful information in order to compile a report or any useful details, especially about the supply chain of China. So I think this is a very important skill set. And sometimes it's way beyond just hiring a bunch of people who understand or speak Chinese. You also need the context, right? Where to go to find the best Chinese source of platform, right? Where to go to Baidu or go to Weibo or other Chinese platform. So you need the social context for that. So you don't just hire a bunch of people who just learn Chinese, but you need a dedicated exclusive agency and people who understand the Chinese social context, hire them in order to allow them to work on this very, very dedicated and very sophisticated work.
Great. Thank you.
We're going to move to a second round if commissioners have more questions they'd like to ask. And so far I have co-chair and Commissioner Kuiken and Commissioner Friedberg, I believe. So, Commissioner Kuiken.
Thank you, Commissioner Schriver. Dr. Endy, there was this report on the Pacific Northwest National Lab website maybe 3 or 4 months ago about how a group of researchers had basically shown up on every continent in the world, stuck a shovel in the ground, put it in a bag, and brought it back and sequenced everything they found in there. In the policy circles around DC, there's this idea now about sequencing everything, and there's some magical advantage to that. I had recently had someone tell me about how the Chinese government is building sort of a belt almost of labs around various parts of Southeast Asia. I obviously have no idea the consequences of this, but can you just sort of give us a sense of what that might mean? That's the first question. I'm just going to give you all of them at once. Convergence. Everyone in DC talks about convergence of AI with, insert the technology. You briefly talked about convergence of AI in biotech. Can you just sort of give it, unlock our minds here in terms of, do I just need to go on ChatGPT and put in some DNA code and I'm magically going to have, a biological weapon or a computer you talked about or some other magical device? And then to Commissioner Price's question about the 1,000 days, you gave a great answer. Boil it down for me. What policy do I need to do, and how much is it going to cost me? It's always helpful to sort of make things sort of a little more crisp on the edges. Sorry for all the questions. Time's over to you.
Thank you, Commissioner Kuiken, for your 3 questions. Sequence everything. Just quickly, 2 ways to think about it. Biology already exists, right? It's operated on this planet for quite a while, and it's got incredibly creative solutions. All right, and so how do we learn what they are? Well, we have to read it out. We have to sequence it. And so if you go around and find biology and read it out, it gives you a chance to make sense of it, to decode it, to read the book of life, so to speak. So that's where this starts. Sequencing is a relatively new technology at scale. 20 plus years ago, we had just barely sequenced ourselves, the human, for the first time. But now it's routinized, and the biggest sequencing factories are in Shenzhen. So what about sequencing everything? If you train ChatGPT on English, you're feeding it in English, right? And then it comes out and gives you something that generates new language. But you could train a large language model on DNA sequences. And so the A's, T's, C's, and G's go into the software, and it learns how to compose A's, T's, C's, and G's. You want to train that on good writing, but the good writing comes from nature. And so if you sequence everything, you have that fuel or data stream that lets us have world-class training of the bio LLMs. So that's number 1. Number 2, remember when that Cold War thing started? And suddenly we were worried about what might be happening on the other side of the Iron Curtain, right? And we needed to develop ways of seeing, planes with cameras and then satellites and so on, GeoInt. Same thing's happening in bio. If you want to have biosecurity, you need to have BioInt. And one of the ways that you could get to BioInt is to sequence things as a start. You want to do other things too. But just imagine you know what's happening in biology because you're sequencing what's going on. Right? So a nucleic acid observatory is part of a BioInt consortium. It's one of the recommendations in the written testimony. Convergence in biotechnology. There's really convergence with 2 big domains. I think about it as joules, bits, and atoms. So energy and data and digital, including AI, and then bio's the atom stuff. I mentioned in passing the convergence of energy and bio, electrobiosynthesis. If you want to follow a lead on that, think about what China's doing with solar panel manufacturing and the idea that scaled photovoltaics could actually be used to grow biology when and where we need it. And then on the AI side, we need to use computing to figure out what the biology is doing and to generate new prototypes. But the important thing is, it's not that AI is some magical tool that solves biology, which a lot of people seem to represent. That's wrong, right? Like, we actually need to understand biology as a physical system, which is why it's so critical to get better tools for measuring biology and modeling biology with physics, not just LLMs and physics-based modeling. And so flagging that. Remind me your last question really quick.
1,000 days. Is it policy? Is it money? Is it both? Give me some concrete things to do.
Yeah, I mean, the things I mentioned in response to Commissioner Schriver's question are just fine. Like, what would it take to get a BML going at NIST? About $250 million a year. What would it take to get 3 national biotechnology accelerators in the United States, $150 million a year. What would it take to do a 1,000-day sprint to build a cell? Less than $100 million. Right? These fit neatly within our existing agencies and portfolios. The issue is everybody is overdriven by the Congress to cure some disease right now, which is well-intended, but misses the mark. So you know, it's like we could have so much higher leverage around our public treasure if we simply thought smartly around where the high leverage results.
Thank you. Commissioner Friedberg, did you want the second round?
Yes, if you don't mind. Dr. Endy, I had a couple of quick questions for you. One of the things you mentioned was the importance of education. Do you happen to have any measure of the adequacy of the, for lack of a better term, the biotech workforce in the United States? Are we training enough people at the right levels? How does it compare to what China is doing?
Very quickly, domestically, I think we do a good job. Where the shortage appears to be is in biomanufacturing, process engineering, all those things needed to operate at scale and supply the market. And then we have a whole bunch of challenges on the front end around the innovation ecosystem because of the boom-bust cycle. And you know, like frankly, there's a lot of people looking for jobs in terms of biotech R&D right now, especially in pharma, and especially as it looks like increasingly that innovation is going to happen overseas. So that's the, you know, sort of two things I would highlight domestically. Things seem to be well staffed in China, and you know, would want to follow up and get a little bit more data just to confirm every nook and cranny of that.
I wanted to make sure I understood the comment that you made about American industries' objections to the Biosecure Act, if I understood your testimony correctly. What exactly is it that American companies depend on Chinese counterparts for?
If you take an example like Wuxi and their service offerings, it's everything from building DNA, building cell lines, making measurements, setting up analytical chemistry processes, setting up the standards around that so that you, when you need to go in for drug approval at FDA, they believe your data, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So all the measurements and the professionalization of measurements and the prototyping, it's all that type of stuff, but just with genetic and living materials as opposed to hardware or software.
And does that dependence have an impact on the relative innovative capacity of American companies versus their Chinese counterparts? Are they being held back in some way by this dependence?
Yeah, that's a great question, Commissioner. Thank you for framing it that way. In the immediate term, it doesn't feel like it, you know, but you're basically getting hooked on somebody else's tooling, right? And so what happens over a longer period of time is because you're distant from the tooling, you don't have that, you know, as sophisticated understanding, you know, for what can be done and what can't be done and how to really make sense of what the results are. So there's a risk that appears over time. The only thing I don't yet have an opinion on is to think a little bit more carefully about the emergence of the fabless semiconductor industry, right? Where over a period of time as silicon matured, you saw very innovative companies not having to own you know, the low-level manufacturing and validation capacities. Over.
Thank you.
Commissioner Sims.
I have one more question for you, Dr. Endy. In 2020, the Director of National Intelligence talked about the Chinese using CRISPR or similar technology to essentially create what he described as super soldiers. And this kind of sparked conversations around ethical boundaries and maybe what things the Chinese are doing or would be willing to do that get outside of the ethical constraints that we would have here in the United States, but could potentially give them an advantage in some way. Are you seeing things like that, and if so, in what areas?
Yeah, I think germline engineering of the human for super soldiers or otherwise has been carefully scrutinized and studied and in many respects denounced within the United States and China. What I think is, we could get into the examples of what happened around some specific cases. What I think is more relevant to your question is thinking about other ways of changing people without changing our DNA, right? So we are more than just our own cells and DNA. We are basically an ecosystem We have microbes that live on our skin and inside us, the so-called microbiome. And making changes in those aspects of how we exist and operate seem likely to not fall into the same ethical category typically, and allow for much quicker changing and prototyping. So for example, there's microbes that live in our guts that emit molecules that change how our brains work, right? And so on and so forth. And so I'd point us to think carefully about other aspects of the human that are beyond the human and the other parts of us that are easy to operate with and change. That's where it seems like there's going to be more innovation and more competition potentially.
So right now you're not seeing areas where they are pushing the ethical boundaries in a way that might give them an advantage?
Not as it relates to the human genome, no.
In things not related to the human genome?
Yeah, not that I would mention here.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks.
Madam Chair?
Thank you. I was just looking over some of the recommendations before we finished the panel. And Mr. Abulafia, if you could just clarify one piece you have. You said in your third recommendations to ensure the U.S. jetliner industry remains competitive in world markets. Do you have a concern there that we're not staying in that direction?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I do indeed have that concern for two reasons. One, as you might have seen, unfortunately, in headlines over the past few years, Boeing has been stumbling in its execution and performance, both of keeping up the cadence of new technology development and in building its existing jets. There's some improvement in the past, say, 6 months or so, but the track record of the past few years has not been good. And of course, for the broader American aerospace industry, we need a healthy Boeing. Of course, they're the most important commercial aviation company by a wide margin. So that's an area of concern. Also, their ability to access the China market has been for political reasons, a little bit compromised. There's signs of improvement here too, but for a couple of years, Airbus went from 50% to basically 90%. That's a concern. And then finally, there is the issue of managing China's rise. So far, it's been a very, very slow road, and there are areas of concern about how quickly they could, move down this road. But nevertheless, there's no question that they want in on this industry, and who knows what the next 10, 15, 20 years could bring, and what are the implications of that for the competitiveness of the Western civil aircraft industry.
Thank you. And quickly to Mr. Chung. I couldn't listen and reread some of your recommendations at the same time, so let me just give you a softball. Anything you listed in your recommendations that we have not already covered that you want the opportunity to put on the top of our agenda? And then I'd ask Dr. Andy the same thing. I think we got through most of yours, though. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. I think I would like to emphasize that, the collaboration between U.S. and its allies is very much important. I'm not just talking about, the basic R&D program, but we have to try to think how to reindustrialize American enterprises and industrial base, and also try to perhaps work with allies to ensure that we have the productivity we want during emergency, because right now, many people talk about Chinese shipbuilding, right? And how did we go there, right? Right now, based on USTR data, Chinese has been making more than 1,000 ships annually. And in the meantime, for the US, only 5, perhaps less than 5 commercial ships. So huge gap there. And now we are witnessing robotic AI going to that way. So China already occupied the industrial base for more than 50% in the world, talking about industrial robots. So if the US does not act fast with the allies to ensure to strengthen the industrial productivity and production, I'm so afraid that we are losing this, in the future.
Thank you. Dr. Andy, any last thoughts on recommendations?
Let me give you a softball back, Chair Price. Bio.gov. A simple website that represents what the United States of America is about and our aspirations regarding the future of biotechnology. We used to have something like this for AI.gov, but there's been a little bit of a hiccup in terms of where that URL redirects. And so this has to be done in a way that sustains across administrative transitions. But something like that, something that says this is what we're about, that lets everybody from entrepreneurs to allies and partners, you name it, right? Like, where's our coordination solution for our dream about a flourishing and American biotic future? Thank you.
Thank you. We are right at time. Appreciate all the witnesses for your contributions. We occasionally ask questions for the record after. You all are volunteers. You've already given us so much, but if there were follow-on questions, we hope you'll have an opportunity to address them and get back to us. But we are now going to take a short break, 9.5 minutes, not 10, reconvene on time.
Thank
Thanks.
you, everyone. Thank you very much for being here today, folks. This is our next panel. Our next panel will project the technology targets in China. China's future economic and industrial strategies, examine its capacity to achieve those targets, and evaluate the effectiveness of U.S. and other countries' technology restrictions on China. We'll start with Mr. Tim Kong, the Director of Global Intelligence at Strider Technologies. Thank you for being here, Mr. Kong. Then we'll go to Ms. Emily de la Bruyere. Hopefully I pronounced that right, Emily. I'm sorry if I did not. I apologize. Emily or Ms. de la Bruyere is the co-founder of Horizon Advisory and a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And then we'll hear from Hannah Doman, research analyst at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technologies. And finally, we'll hear from Mr. David Lin, Senior Director for Future Technology Platforms at the Special Competitive Studies Project. Thank you to all of you for your wonderful testimony, or your submitted statements. The Commission is looking forward to hearing your remarks, and we'll go through 7 minutes for your round, and then we'll go through a series of questions, and then we'll go from there. Thank you very much to everyone, and Mr. Kong, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Co-Chair Schriver, Kuiken, Commissioners, and staff. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. My testimony will focus on China's talent acquisition mechanisms because it really truly lies at Xi Jinping's stated strategy for global technological dominance. I would also like to touch on how China's talent strategies have evolved over the years and powered the success of Made in China 2025. By the way of quick introduction, I work for Strider Technologies. Strider collects publicly available data, primarily from sources in adversarial nations, and transforms them into actionable intelligence. 30 years ago, China's economy and technology was so far behind world leaders that its top minds and scientists had really nowhere to go but abroad to participate in cutting-edge research. It was a gap that was recognized by the PRC government, and they began an aggressive and systematic campaign to absorb talent and technologies from around the world. The challenge for the United States and its allies is now there's a flywheel effect of talent spotting and absorption that shows no sign of slowing, even though China's domestic ecosystem for innovation is more powerful than ever before. So this is what I came here to say today. I just got a couple of points. There's been no coordinated effort from the United States or its allies to counter China's talent acquisition efforts. We have failed to stop the PRC talent absorption machine. Second, unlike China, the United States has no centralized strategy for attracting and keeping the best talent in this country. When it comes to the competition for talent, the United States is like a naturally gifted athlete who doesn't practice, doesn't have a coach, and relies on improvisation and intuition to win games. China, on the other hand, might be compared to a less talented athlete, but it's bigger than us, has a coaching staff, and works out every day. If we are to win this competition, we need a coaching staff, we need a strategy, and we need to practice. For the rest of my testimony, I would like to tell the story of how China got to where it is today, and give some examples of their tactics and their procedures. So how do we get here? Let's start with Xi Jinping. The order comes down from the very top. Over and over in his speeches and directives, Xi commands and calls on the PRC and the CCP to win the competition for global talent. This push for talent acquisition is enshrined in the all-important CCP document known as Xi Jinping Thought. The war for talent, 人才, appears no less than 34 times in this document. When an order like this comes down, there's this entire ecosystem of organizations in the CCP, the government, academia, and industry that mobilizes themselves to execute Xi Jinping's plans. And this is how it worked for Made in China 2025. In 2015, the National Advisory Committee implementing the MIC 2025 policy published a 190-page document called the Technology Roadmap for Made in China 2025. It specified almost 2,000 technologies targeted for systematic acquisition. When Strider took these technology terms and matched them up with the expertise of the people who work at the top 1,000 companies around the world, even with the most conservative matching algorithms, we got more than 1.1 million people matching for potential targets for recruitment. Now, this is how it works on the ground. If you have expertise that matches up and aligns with the technologies that are specified in MIC 2025, your chances of being recruited or approached by a PRC recruiter increases significantly. We see this every day at Strider, and I saw it firsthand working in the HR industry throughout the 2010s in China myself. China's central government reported that its talent programs have recruited at least 60,000 talents from overseas, and that's a figure from 2016. They stopped publishing this data, smart on them, but Strider has been tracking over 400 talent programs, and we know that even with the most conservative estimates, this number's gotta be well over 100,000 people by now. And even just the 1,000 talent program, which aimed to attract 1,000 talents, that number is over 10,000. So they really blew past their goals. This type of centralization and coordination stretches to private HR companies in China and also to nonprofit organizations based right here in the United States. These private HR companies recruit talent on behalf of the CCP with the stated purpose of, quote, strengthening the country through talent introduction. Now, using these private companies, it has a lot of benefits. It gives a sheen of legitimacy to the recruitment efforts and plausible deniability for the CCP. And some of these companies have raised hundreds of millions of dollars in our stock markets and in the US stock exchanges. I mean, talk about adding insult to injury here. And it's not just the domestic Chinese companies that the CCP controls. There is a 501c nonprofit ecosystem in the US. Let me give you one example. This one is based in Atlanta, Georgia, whose main source of income is the PRC government. Its leader was honored by none other than Xi Jinping in 2014 for, quote, using the Georgia Institute of Technology as a platform to train more than 110 graduate students and visiting scholars for China. During my time at Strider, I've seen hundreds of examples of this. And perhaps the most important macro-level shift in China's tech transfer strategies is the rising number of research collaborations with risky entities. Of particular concern is the increase in the number of collaborations with organizations affiliated with the PRC military. Since 2017, more than 250 organizations in the US have collaborated with at least 50 PRC military-affiliated research institutes on STEM-related topics on thousands of publications. Our higher education system is the soft underbelly of our innovation environment. The CCP knows it, and they're taking advantage of it. For decades, the PRC government has leveraged both returning talent and homegrown innovation to advance towards technological self-sufficiency. And by adapting to new challenges with innovative strategies, the PRC continues to find ways through our fences. And if we do not act and act soon, this will simply continue. And we cannot expect to win the competition with China by relying on our natural gifts and our good looks. In my written testimony, I offer some more detailed policy recommendations. I look forward to delving in a bit further during the Q&A portion. Thank you very much.
Go ahead. We'll just go straight down the table.
Perfect. Hearing co-chairs, distinguished commissioners and staff of the USCC, and of course, fellow panelists, it's an honor to participate in today's hearing. Thank you. China uses its industrial capacity to project power. Beijing sees industrial strength not only as a means to enhance the nation's economic prowess, military capabilities, and social system. Industrial strength also secures the asymmetric dependence of the rest of the world. Beijing uses that dependence for strategic ends in order to tie foreign incentives to China's own and ultimately to shape foreign markets, politics, information, technology, and, in a self-reinforcing fashion, industry itself. In other words, Beijing is using industry to overtake and to overpower the United States. This is the ambition in Made in China 2025 and in China's larger ecosystem of industrial policies and investments. The stakes for the US are enormous. The Made in China 2025 plan is the first of 3 10-year programs that are intended to build China into the world's dominant industrial power and therefore the world's dominant power. Should the CCP realize its ambitions, the US industrial and defense industrial bases will become entirely reliant on China. That in turn will mean that China can shape, determine, influence the prosperity and security that depend on those bases. Beijing will be able to decide what companies win and lose, have access, for instance, to critical technology, inputs, markets. And therefore, Beijing will be able to shape the American political and social system that depends on and is influenced by markets. Moreover, in a modern technological environment, China's control over American industry will give it control over American information. 10 years ago, when Beijing issued Made in China 2025, to paint this future was to describe an abstract, almost impossible threat. Today, there's nothing abstract about it. The priorities in Made in China 2025 include, for instance, telecommunications equipment and network security. Today, Beijing has infiltrated virtually the entire US telecoms network. New energy sectors, like solar and batteries, as well as the critical materials on which they depend, also figure in the priorities of Made in China 2025. Today, China controls about 90% of the global solar value chain and a similar share in batteries, including 80% of graphite supply. Made in China 2025 also prioritizes advanced semiconductor packaging. China is the dominant global player in that field too, with more than 50% of global market share. That means that even the quote-unquote crown jewels of the US semiconductor ecosystem and global semiconductor ecosystem are shipping their products to China for packaging. It also gives China a means to evade US tech restrictions. These cases reflect Made in China 2025 working and hurting the United States. They give China, respectively, control over American information, energy, technology, and across-the-board markets. They also show the US failure to respond, even in the fields that have been most prioritized in American policy. In telecommunications, a battery of US company-level restrictions on Chinese state champions have not stopped China from infiltrating our networks, nor have they stopped US companies from depending on, selling to, and lobbying on behalf of Chinese players, known bad actors and unknown ones, Huawei's and hidden Huawei's. In semiconductors, new energy, and critical materials, the US has issued unprecedented government support to try to support domestic industry. That has proven no match for China's industrial dominance. In solar, some half of IRA-funded projects are China-backed because of a dearth of alternatives as well as a dearth of guardrails. In critical materials, like graphite, government loans and grants have proved insufficient in getting domestic industry off the ground in a market and amid a customer set that China controls. The problem is that the US and China are playing different games. Beijing isn't competing to be a first mover in developing the best, newest technology. Beijing is competing to control markets and resources.